What's up, everybody? Sorry. Hey guys, my name's Dylan, and I'm the creator of the greatest mobile puzzle game of all time, Emoji Pop, which you can play by going to playemojipop.com. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I'm standing beside the Mona Lisa at the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, to talk to you about video games. Now, you might be asking yourself, Dylan, why did you travel all the way to an art museum in Paris, France to talk about video games? My goal with this video is not to convince you that video games are art. My goal with this video is to convince you that all art is games. That's right, even the Mona Lisa is a game. There's a lot of people, including the famous film critic Roger Ebert, who believe that video games can never achieve the same level of artistry as other art forms, including paintings, for example. Ebert believes that, in video games, a player's direct participation in the work ruins any opportunity for authorial intents. He believes that in serious art forms, it's the role of the audience to observe, not to directly partake in the work. Now, I can see how he would think that, but frankly, I think that's Oh, pardon my French, guys. One of the problems with this question, can games be art, is that our current definitions of art, the ones used by critics like Roger Ebert, don't really hold up today. Instead of trying to prove that video games are art as we have thought of art in the past, we need to radically change the way we think about art in general. Plato believed that the basis of art was representation, or mimesis. From this perspective, art is all about representing things in the real world. During the Romantic movement, the purpose of art began to shift from dutiful representation to the expression of feelings and emotions. In expressionist works, the emotional response of the audience far outweighs the importance of realistically portraying the external world. For example, the painting I'm currently in by Edvard Munch is called Anxiety. It's interesting to compare the emotion of this painting to the emotion found in his most famous work, The Scream of Nature. While Anxiety seems to convey a gentle, collective despair, Scream conveys a lonely, piercing horror. Both are symbolic of the condition of modern man. For hundreds of years, Western art was underpinned by the logic of perspective and the attempt to recreate visual reality to some degree. In the 1800s, some artists felt compelled to create new kinds of art, which embraced changes taking place in technology, science, and philosophy. This new philosophy of art, called abstraction, put the focus of art on form and aesthetic. Expressionism and Romanticism are two early movements in this shift towards abstraction. There were also Impressionists like Monet, who captured the momentary sensory feelings of a scene through small brushstrokes and the inclusion of movement. Cubists like Pablo Picasso broke up objects and reassembled them from different perspectives as his own way of fracturing reality. Fauvists like Henri Matisse emphasized painterly qualities and strong color. Out of these movements came Orphism, which focused on pure abstraction and bright colors. Over the next century, artists continue to find new ways of exploring form and aesthetic without relying on subject matter. I've just described to you three different ways to think about art. The first values representation, the second values emotion, and the third values form. All of these philosophies are incredibly useful and valid ways to think about art, but none of them is the universal philosophy. Which philosophy matters most to the artist depends on the medium they're working in, as well as the world that they're living in. For example, the oldest philosophy of art, which placed emphasis on realistically portraying the world, found resurgence during the realism movement in France during the 1840s, and also during the social realist movement in America following the Great Crash. Realists rejected Romanticism, which tended to focus on exotic subject matter and exaggerated emotionalism. The realists wanted to truthfully portray the world around them as a means of protesting the conditions of working people following the Industrial Revolution. For example, this painting, The Gleaners, by Jean-François Millet, sympathetically portrays three peasant women gleaning wheat. Gleaning was the legal right of peasants to pick over the leftover scraps after farmers had harvested their crops for sale, which you can see them doing in the background. This painting made the French upper class incredibly nervous about their position in society. I would argue that Millet's rhetorical use of realism in this painting made this message much more powerful than if he had focused on emotion or form. At this point, some of you are probably yelling at your computer screens. Dylan, I clicked on this video to learn about video games. Why do you keep going on about paintings? My point with all of this is that there's not just one way to think about art. Our understanding of art is complex and multifaceted and evolving. So when someone asks me a dumb question like, can games be art? I don't even know what the hell that means. Many of us are still clinging to outdated definitions of art, but historically, those who assert old philosophies of art when faced with the emergence of new methods of expression end up in the trash can of history every single time. I believe we are currently at a major point of transformation in the history of art, just as important as any of the evolutions of art I've discussed so far. The emergence of computation in the World Wide Web has dramatically altered audiences' expectations and tastes, and has also dramatically changed the ways in which we consume and create media. It has also given rise to the medium of video games, which has introduced the interactivity that makes so many art critics and scholars nervous. However, I don't think this interactivity is actually that new. I think video games have revealed that interactivity has existed at the core of art all along. When you look at a painting, it doesn't seem like you're interacting with it, but you actually are. For example, you have to physically move your eyeballs across the image in order to receive all of the visual information. In the same way that you would use a joystick in a video game to change the angle from which you view the world. Okay, enough about the paintings. Let's look at an example from film. I want to examine the work of Brian De Palma, an American director whose most famous work is Scarface.
Say hello to my little friend!
One of the really unique features of his work is his use of the split screen shot, where instead of displaying one image, the screen is split into multiple images, usually showing different perspectives. But my favorite example of his split screen technique is in his 1976 movie Carrie. One of the reasons I love his use of the split screen in Carrie is that he uses it so sparingly, saving it for the climax of the film. The whole movie feels like a roller coaster where you are slowly climbing up the whole time, anxiously anticipating the huge drop at the end. You watch Carrie struggle at school and at home with foreboding dread. Most of the movie features just one image, like most movies do. But finally, at the climax of the film, when Carrie finally loses control following a disastrous prank at the homecoming dance, the image suddenly splits into two. The effect of this split image is that viewers are suddenly forced to shift their focus between the two images in order to witness everything that's happening. There is a constant choice of which side of the screen to pay attention to, since you can't focus on both at the same time, so you have to keep switching back and forth. This choice leads to an increased sense of immersion, not entirely dissimilar from the immersion experienced in video games. The dual shot increases the level with which the audience must participate in the film. It feels like you are actually there, watching all of this go down in the exact moment where you definitely do not want to be there. I argue that this split-screen technique, which heightens and makes obvious the physical role that audiences play when watching a film, is an example of interactivity in a medium that's supposedly non-interactive. I believe that the interactivity in Carrie, though limited, is very similar to the interactivity found in some video games. For example, in the 2012 game Proteus, created by Ed Key and David Kanaga, the player moves around a colorful island, but there isn't much to do besides that. This interaction isn't really that different than the interactions found in movies, which also require you to look around. Proteus doesn't allow you to manipulate the environment. There is no way of winning or losing. There's no signal that you are even inhabiting a real protagonist. These qualities actually led some to say that Proteus isn't a video game. But if it's not a video game, then what is it? Proteus proves that these extra layers of explicit interaction aren't necessary to label something a video game, And I think the reason why many gamers are uncomfortable calling it a game is because if you admit that Proteus is a game, you must also admit that games are not a strict medium as we have thought of artistic mediums in the past. Game is a quality of art that is very malleable and present in all art. Sure, Proteus has some features that seem exclusive to video games. There is dynamic music, which changes based on where you move. But couldn't you argue that films feature dynamic imaging in the sense that the visuals you receive depend on where you look? The island is procedurally generated each time, so each playthrough is slightly different. But this feature does not inherently change the interaction model. It would still be a game without procedural generation. Imagine for a minute that you're sitting down at a crazy new theater in your town that shows films not on standard square screens, but on rounded screens that surround you from 360 degrees, so you actually have to turn your body to see the different parts of the movie. Would you still consider this to be a film? I think most people would, although a highly unconventional one. Now imagine that you view the film by putting on a VR headset that you can look around in. Is this still a movie? Or is it a game? Now imagine that this VR film takes place in 3D space that you have to sort of navigate around to view the different parts of the film. Much like in Proteus. Is this a game or is it a movie? My point is that the line that's drawn between video games and movies is incredibly blurred. If you think video games are unique because of their interactivity, I think you are dead wrong, because films also show a degree of interactivity, although these interactions are usually less obvious and more restrained due to their limited use of technology to this point. Hey, quick reminder that I upload videos like this every Monday, so please subscribe to my channel and let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Okay, back to the video. Now I want to give you an example in a non-visual medium of a work of art that I believe exhibits interactivity. Infinite Jest is a novel written by David Foster Wallace that explores, among other things, the problem with the desire, particularly of Americans, to constantly gratify their compulsive desires, and how technology and entertainment is feeding into this problem. It's a very playful and complex book. It's over 1,000 pages long and features a non-linear narrative that's constantly jumping back and forth between different years and settings and even different writing styles. Reading it takes a lot of work, which makes it very different than most commercial entertainment. This is something Wallace has thought a lot about.
Reading requires sitting alone by yourself in a quiet room, and I have friends, intelligent friends, who don't like to read because it's not just bored. There's an almost dread when you feel like the purpose of your life is to gratify yourself and get things for yourself and go all the time. There's this other part of you that's the same part that can kind of is almost hungry for silence and quiet and thinking really hard about the same thing for maybe half an hour instead of 30 seconds, that doesn't get fed at all. It becomes more and more difficult to ask people to read or to look at a piece of art for an hour, or to listen to a piece of music that's complicated and that takes work to understand, because, well, there are a lot of reasons, but particularly now in computer and internet culture, everything is so fast. It seems to me that the biggest split isn't between music and literature or music and sculpture or whatever. There are forms of art that offer us escapes from ourselves and our daily lives, and I think that's fine in small doses. And then there are kinds of art that offer us more sort of confrontation.
One of the most unique aspects of Infinite Jest is that the book contains hundreds of endnotes. While reading, you will occasionally come across a number that references an endnote that the reader must flip to the back of the book in order to read. Some of these endnotes are very short, but others can be entire chapters to themselves. I believe that the inclusion of endnotes in Infinite Jest constitutes interactivity. Wallace must have known that not all of the readers would read all of the endnotes. This choice of whether or not to read the endnotes drastically changes the experience of reading the novel. The endnotes are just one element of playfulness and interactivity that Wallace uses to convince readers to put the work in required to read the novel. Here's another interview with David Foster Wallace. Notice how he describes books as an exchange and how he uses the word fun. To me, this description of books is an admittance of the game-like properties of the medium.
On the one hand, it can be difficult and it can be redemptive and morally instructive and all the good stuff we learn in school. On the other hand, it's supposed to be fun. I think part of the fun for me was being part of some kind of exchange between consciousnesses, a way for human beings to talk to each other about stuff that we normally can't talk about. One of the things that I want is to do something that is, it's complicated and it's hard, and it's weird, but it's also seductive enough so that you're willing to do the work to go through that. And a lot of that has to do with trying, yes, to be delightful. And a lot of it has to do with, good Lord, I'm really stretching myself. I'm really having to think and process and feel in ways I don't normally feel. Because I think commercial entertainment has conditioned readers to want kind of more easy fun, I think avant-garde and art fiction has sort of relinquished the field and is now, basically I don't read much contemporary avant-garde stuff because it's hellaciously unfun. But these days a lot of it is very academic and cloistered and basically written for critics and college teachers and PhD students.
There's a huge spectrum of interactivity that writers can embrace to challenge their readers in interesting new ways. Infinite Jest's endnotes are one small example of this. Choose Your Own Adventure stories are an example of prose employing a much higher degree of interactivity, as players are given choices along the way which affect the path of the prose. These books don't have to be written for just children. I think writers of literary fiction should try writing books in this form. Text adventures are another form of literature that take the same path-based structure as Choose Your Own Adventure stories, but give readers many more choices by utilizing technology. This again proves my point regarding the obscurity that exists between video games and other media. Text adventures are commonly considered to be video games. In fact, they're one of the pioneering genres of the field. And yet, they're not all that structurally different than Choose Your Own Adventure stories. Some of my favorite text adventures include Photopia by Adam Cadre and Galatea by Emily Short. There's also a huge possibility space that exists somewhere in the middle of standard prose and traditional video games. Large-scale RPGs, like Elder Scrolls for example, use in-game literature as a way of adding layers to its fictional universe, but there's also ways video games can use literature in much more central ways. The game Today I Die by Dan Benmergui is an excellent example of a game that combines poetry with puzzles and makes the prose a central part of the experience. There are so many ways that media, like film and prose, can interact with audiences. But I'm guessing there are still some of you who believe that there are still some static works of art that totally lack interactivity. Even if it were theoretically possible for a work of art to be devoid of interactivity, which I don't think it's possible, I still think we could view these static works of art through the lens of interactivity. The lack of interactivity in art is kind of like linearity in storytelling. Most stories are told linearly, meaning they take place in chronological order from beginning to end. A minority of stories are told non-linearly, meaning they take place out of order. Non-linear stories are the exception, but that doesn't mean we ignore linearity in standard stories. The lack of a non-linear narrative is an important aspect of a work, and audiences should question why the author chose to write the story in linear fashion, and if that linearity has any connections with the themes or other aspects of the work. The same goes for static works of art that minimize interactivity. In a standard novel that doesn't include endnotes and choices, even if we pretend that the reader isn't actively interacting with the text, the property of interactivity still persists through its absence. In a static work, the lack of interactivity is still a critical aspect of that work. This proves that the property of interactivity is a universal property of all art. The minimization of interactivity can exist uniquely in all forms of media, even in video games, as exhibited in my earlier example of Proteus. Another example is the web game The Killer by Jordan Magnuson. The game features a stick figure with a gun marching another stick figure to be executed on the beach. For most of the game, the player must hold down the spacebar to march the gunman to the right. There is no other option. When the player lets go of the spacebar, the game simply waits for them to press down again. This minimization of interactivity is rhetorically significant. It causes players to confront the sense of doom felt by the prisoner and the thoughtless, machine-like quality of systemic death we have witnessed in historic events like the Holocaust and the Cambodian genocide, which is what Magnuson actually made the game about. Interestingly, in works of art that seem totally devoid of interactivity, the strongest of interactions can occur. Take these black paintings by Ad Reinhardt, an American abstract expressionist. If you saw this at a museum, most people wouldn't even stop to look at it for a moment. Actually, this painting is incredibly and uniquely interactive. To perceive what's actually happening in this image, you have to stop and look at it for a while. After a couple of minutes, the rods and cones in your eyeballs start to line up and allow you to perceive that this seemingly totally black square is actually divided into 9 smaller squares, which form a sort of crucifix-like shape. The actual content of this painting doesn't emerge unless the audience puts a significant amount of work into perceiving it. Also, this effect doesn't translate to photography or film, so you actually have to be there in person to receive this information. That makes this physical interaction with the painting a central part of the work of art. In 1952, American composer John Cage completed his most famous work, 433. 433 contains 3 movements of no deliberate sound. The performer simply sits there quietly for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Uniquely, it can be played on any instrument. Let's have a listen for a moment. There are many conclusions that can be drawn from this quiet piece of music. One of them is that the behavior of the audience is an integral part of the work of art, that the work of art does not exist entirely separate from the audience. Following its first performance at the Maverick Concert Hall, John Cage had this to say about it. They missed the point. There's no such thing as silence. What they thought was silence, because they didn't know how to listen, was full of accidental sounds. You could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, raindrops began pattering the roof, and during the third, the people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they talked or walked out. Now we're finally back where we started this video, at the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is an interactive work of art because of the way you have to physically use your eyeballs to view its contents. Although this interaction is minimal, the mostly static nature of the work is also an important aspect of the art to be viewed through the lens of interactivity. But even the Mona Lisa isn't entirely static. For example, no matter which angle you view the work of art from, it looks like she's looking straight at you. That's a property of the work that requires interaction to reveal. But our physical interactions with the Mona Lisa affect the work in much deeper ways than that. The painting wasn't even that well known until it was stolen in 1911, which inspired international headlines, especially after Pablo Picasso was named as a suspect. If it weren't for someone physically grabbing the work of art and running out of the museum with it, the Mona Lisa would have an entirely different meaning to us today. It would not be the same iconic work of art that we all know and love. But what really captivates most people about the Mona Lisa today are the mysteries surrounding the work. Is she smiling or is she frowning? Who is this woman anyway? What's this landscape supposed to be of? Mysteries in art like this are left up to the interpretation of the audience, who define the work in their own way based on their own experiences. When observing the Mona Lisa, we are also interacting with society's view of the work, with the public discourse that surrounds the painting. In summary, the audience is responsible for defining works like the Mona Lisa, not through paint, but through our physical and mental interactions with it. But the potential for interactivity goes even deeper than that. In recent years, scientists and analysts have dug deeper into the painting to uncover new elements that were previously unknown, thus changing the work of art both physically and conceptually. In 2010, an Italian researcher claimed to have discovered hidden codes in the Mona Lisa. Not that kind of code, though. He claims to have found an S in her left eye and an L in her right eye. He also spotted the number 72 hidden in the background. The hypothesis is that the 7 is a religious symbol for the 7 days in a week, and that 2 is symbolic of male-female duality, thus furthering speculation that the Mona Lisa is actually a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci himself in female form. A 3D scan of the painting revealed that da Vinci had altered the position of Mona Lisa's fingers at some point in the process. It also revealed that Mona Lisa was wearing a veil previously unseeable that would suggest she was expecting a child. All of our interactions with the Mona Lisa have substantially changed the work of art, both physically and conceptually. This is further proof that we need to seriously consider the interactivity of all art, even art that came 500 years before the invention of video games. So, that all brings me to my final questions. If all art is interactive, then what does that mean for video games? What even are video games, and what is their relation to the rest of the art world? Mexican artist David Siqueiros called paintbrushes implements of hair and wood in an age of steel, and encouraged artists to adopt modern tools in order to represent our modern experience. The American abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock, after World War II, made paintings by laying his canvas down flat on the floor and dripping paint from above. He said that new needs need new techniques. The modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atomic bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or of any past culture. I don't need to remind you how drastically our world has changed, even since the 1950s when Jackson Pollock said this. This is why this topic is so important to me. I think it is essential that we embrace the interactivity and artistic possibilities of video games, which is why I'm so disappointed when some say that video games cannot achieve the same level of art, or when other gamers say that games have already achieved the same level of art and we don't need to push it any further. We need artists of traditional media to embrace the power of interactivity and game design in their own unique ways. If you believe that popular, easily digestible works are ruining the serious potential for art forms like movies and books, which get said a lot, then I think the solution is to advance these art forms through an embrace of interactivity in order to challenge audiences in delightful new ways, utilizing modern technologies that best reflect our modern experience. We also need game developers to strive for more than just easy-to-digest fun gameplay or seamlessly engaging narratives. We need games to explore the vast possibilities of art and interactivity, and to make serious statements about art and our modern world that only video games can make. Most importantly of all, I need you, the viewers, to interact with me by commenting below what you think of this video. Do you agree with me that interactivity is a universal property of art? Also, please subscribe because I upload videos like this every Monday, and I would love to learn what you want to know more about, whether it's about high-level theory regarding art and interactivity, or if there's certain video games that you would like me to do deep-level analyses on. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next Monday.